The Sheila Zielinski Show, the only show to give you the truth behind the headlines, prophecy, and the deeper things of God. Now, here is your host, Sheila Zielinski.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Sheila Zielinski Show for this Friday, June 3rd, 2016 edition. I broadcast Monday to Friday. That's weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on WINB. Hey, to find out more ways to listen, including the podcast and that customized app, which, by the way, I'm getting some great feedback on, go to the Listen tab on the menu at weekendvigilante.com. Downloading the podcast for those on the go. Take my show along with you and listen while you're driving, jogging, walking. But as I said yesterday, maybe not so much swimming. There is so much to get into today. I am sure by now that everyone's heard this rendition of Porky Pig. Let's hear this incredible, astute speech by the Commander-in-Chief, Barack Obama. Take a listen for yourself.
And the one thing I can promise you is if we turn against each other based on divisions of race or religion, if we fall for, a bunch of okey doke, just because it sounds.
That's all, folks. You just can't make this stuff up, and that, my friends, is who is in charge of the United States of America. You did us proud there, Barry. Well, we've got a great guest today, folks, and I'm very anxious to bring him on. My guest today is Ken Schortgen. I call him the Chuck Norris of economics. He is a writer for secretsofthefed.com, theexaminer.com, roguemoney.net, To the Death Media, and the host of the very popular The Daily Economist. I am so glad to bring him back on the show today to weigh in on what is going on economically. Ken Schortgen, welcome back to the program. It is a pleasure to have you back on.
Thanks, Sheila, and pleasure to be here as always.
Well, Ken, there's a lot happening on the economic front here. Even the good news is bad news. And according to a very disappointing statistical report today from the Labor Department, it's an ominous sign for the U.S. economy when you see the slowest pace, and I mean the slowest pace of job growth in 5 years. And then, of course, on the heels of that, I don't know if you saw this, but Obama, this is absolutely hilarious, Ken. You've got Mr. Legacy of Lies himself, Barack Obama. He goes to Indiana, gives this speech on his legacy, on how he basically single-handedly saved the economy following the 2008 credit crises. And he goes on and on to talk about what I call peddling fiction, deception around the unemployment rate, and the fact that, hey, nothing to see here, folks. Move along. The economy is doing just fine. But that is not the case, is it, Ken? Where do we start with all this?
Well, we can start with first with Obama's nice little attempt at a legacy in Indiana. The thing I've always found is that when somebody has to stump their own legacy, that means that the information in the data itself isn't enough to hold up on its own. He likes to talk about the unemployment rate. Well, the unemployment rate is a sham. Think about this. We only got 38,000 jobs today, which is the lowest level since the height of the Great Recession in 2010. And the unemployment rate went down from 4.9 to 4.7%. How does the unemployment rate drop when you need at least 150 to 200,000 jobs every month just to keep up with population demands?
Yeah, wow.
That's an impossible anomaly. That's a statistical deception to begin with. But the fact of the matter is the reason that the unemployment rate went down is because there's two components. In the total workforce, there's the number of people who are in the workforce that are counted, and then there's the number of people who have jobs. And you divide that and you get a certain percentage of who's unemployed and who's employed. Well, the way you make the unemployment rate go down is that you either create jobs, which they haven't been doing, or you remove people from the labor force. And that's what they did, going back to even before in the Clinton years, they started monkeying with the models. And so what they do is if you're not on unemployment insurance, you don't have a job according to the survey, then you're a persona non grata. And in America, we have 94.6 persona non gratas. Unemployment rate is about 23 to 26%. Say the whole labor force is 164 million workers between the ages of 18 and 55. That's the general term. Now, if you take the total number of people, 164 million, and you take the number of people who are actually employed, which I believe is about 70 million, that leaves 90 million people who do not show up on the report. They call them the ones who no longer are looking for jobs. Well, you think 90 million people want to go with no salary, no pay, and try to live on the street? We'd have a homeless rate that was through the roof. No, these are people who are mostly the ones getting welfare, but they're no longer looking for a job because the only jobs out there are low wage, low skilled service industry. And if you take a look at the real data, see, they love to tell the surface data, 38,000 jobs created or 250,000 jobs. But since 2008 and the credit crisis, we have lost somewhere up to 1.7 million manufacturing jobs, and we've only created the equivalent in part-time or, as they say, bartender jobs. So you have low-wage jobs, you have part-time jobs, and here's something else, the reason that the unemployment rate is so high is because they don't count individuals. They count numbers of jobs created. So if an individual has 3 part-time jobs, that counts as 3 jobs, not one person with 3 part-time jobs equaling a full-time job. And that's another way that they get the unemployment rate down. Now, the important thing about this is that the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, has been trying to justify a rate hike in June or July.
Yeah, that's right.
And they're using 2 different models. They're using inflation, which they say is below 2%, but for any consumer who goes and buys gas, groceries, retail, we know that it's more along the lines of 8% per annum, if not per month. And it's also the unemployment rate, the jobs rate. Well, the jobs have been below their baseline of 5% now for the last 6 months. So why haven't they raised rates? The reason is because deep down they know that the economy is in much worse condition, that the jobs conditions are far worse, but the Fed has become a political tool, and they are scared to death of somebody like Donald Trump getting in there because he's going to start interfering with the Fed. Janet Yellen will be out, and we might actually finally have the audit. So they desperately want to make Obama look good, keep the economy going through the election, and they also want Hillary Clinton in there because she will keep things at status quo.
Well, actually, Donald Trump did say on record, people can look this up, he said just last week, Janet Yellen would be out. Now, Yellen, Fed chair, I call her Bernanke 2.0 in a skirt, she's actually going to let the economy run hot, as you just said. Now, what's interesting, Ken, she recently said at the Economic Club of New York that the United States economy, it's on track. Hey, it's a little bit of a rough start to the year, but hey, nothing to see here, folks. But really, Ken, the jig is up here. The Ponzi scheme is up here, isn't it?
Yeah, and you have to look at a number of different factors. Like I said, go behind the scenes. There is a former Fed chairman who's going around the circuit trying to redesignate his legacy.
Alan Greenspan, yeah.
Alan Greenspan, so suddenly he loves gold, but for the entire time he was in his office printing money like there was no tomorrow, he despised gold. And then, of course, Ben Bernanke, who's an academic who absolutely knew nothing about anything, he's trying to justify that the Fed saved the economy and that Janet Yellen, what she's doing is carrying on the legacy of what we've done in saving the economy. So they have created a narrative over the last 15 to 20 years of the Fed is in charge. They know what they're doing. They're competent. And they're going to be the ones to carry through the rough spots and through the good times. You have all of these agencies. You have Wall Street. You have the housing bubble. You have the dollar. You have now that the banks are interlinked, you have the ECB. You have the Bank of Japan. The whole global financial system is interlinked. And if the Fed sneezes, then you see what happened today. The dollar goes down, declines by 100 basis points. You see gold go up. You see Europe, which was in the positive until the jobs report came out, ended the day in the negative. The reason why is because as the dollar got weaker, the euro got stronger, and so their exports are going to be much more expensive. And it's just everything is so interlinked. So I'll take this to another point. Earlier in the month, and we'll go back to May, the 4 Fed presidents, this is unprecedented, 4 regional Fed presidents publicly announced over and over and over that the Fed was going to raise rates and that the economy was good and that everything was going to be fine. Well, when they did this, the dollar, which had already been hovering close to 115 to the euro, fell down to 111. And gold dropped from its 52-week high of 1,300 down to about 1,200 level. The reason they did this is because Wall Street has these high-frequency trading computers and these algorithms, and they are keyed into news, and they're keyed into keywords. So these Fed presidents know that they can manipulate the market by just going public and saying something. And that's why 4 of them came to really crash gold, to bring the dollar down, and to try to justify, yes, we're going to have a rate hike. But the jobs report that came out today, 38,000 new jobs, is indicative of a 3-month trend of jobs reports that have come in lower than expectations. So this is no longer an anomaly. This is a trend, and they know it. But for them to come out all of a sudden when they said last year they're ready to raise rates 7 times between the next 2.5 years, and now all of a sudden backtrack and say, wait a second, the economy is not as good as it's supposed to be. We're going to go ahead and maybe start lowering rates. That's going to show how inept they are and that they really don't know what's going on.
There is so much in what you just said there. Think about that. The Federal Reserve, it really is playing 3-card Monte with itself only. They have 1 foot in the grave and 1 foot on a banana peel. The preeminence is gone. Reserve status, goodbye. That's gone. Everyone is bypassing the US dollar. I mean, think about the history. Forget being cited. They're being vetted as the Forex fraud, the bond fraud, the gold market fraud, derivatives fraud. Everyone has figured out that this is a fake, fraudulent, chicanerous system, and no one wants to do business with a crazy, out-of-control bunch of lunatics that are running the U.S. The jig is up. The Great Depression Ponzi scheme, it's up. There's no net buyers even of U.S. Treasury in this cadre. The jig is up, Ken.
Well, that's just it. The only reason that the Fed actually raised rates in December is not because the economy was good or justified it. It's because, just as you said, from August to December, about $650 billion in U.S. Treasuries were shipped back from foreigners to the Fed or to the Treasury. The Fed had to intercede. And what they did, of course, is they used either Euroclear in Belgium or they used the ESF, which is the Exchange Stabilization Fund. Because if $600 billion in treasuries had gotten into the open market, then that would have completely collapsed the U.S. bond market, and the treasury and the dollar would have been toast right away. But they had to siphon those treasuries before they got to the market. And that's what the Fed did by raising rates, is they used that to allow the reverse repo window to give a little bit extra percentage to banks that were going to go ahead and cover and collect all these treasuries. So that was the reason for the Fed rate hike. It had nothing to do with the economy. It had to do with saving the dollar and all these treasuries that were being dumped. Now, what they're trying to do, of course, is they're trying to keep the meme going that the economy is great and we're ready to hike. Well, the time for them to hike would have been actually about 2014. Well, it's a little bit too late. We are now in a global recession. We're in an industrial recession. The only thing they're waiting for is the service recession. And here's the thing about the Fed. The Fed will never tell anybody that we are in recession until we're long into it and pretty much on the way out. They'll never admit it. But we had negative growth in December 2014. We had negative growth going into a couple quarters last year. And this is what the government did to try to justify that we weren't in a recession. They have these things called seasonal adjustments on most of their reporting models. Well, for the GDP, they actually do now a double seasonal adjustment. They tack on twice. Yeah. So if the growth for the economy was, say, negative 1%, then one adjustment would make it negative 0.3%, and the next adjustment would take it up to 0.5%. That's what they did. These are numbers pulled out of thin air to try to, and since, like I said, The entire Wall Street is built on computer algorithms that do 75% of all trades, billions at a time, per nanosecond. So that's how they control the stock market. There was a new report that came out last month that said that only 30% of the people who were actually in the stock market prior to 2008, only 30% are still in it.
Right.
The other 70% are gone. What you're seeing in the Wall Street has nothing to do with your retirement, nothing to do with your pensions. It just has to do with speculation and risk.
Well, it's so much about speculation and risk. And it's clear that this worst jobs data report, worst jobs they're calling it since September 2010 report, has certainly thrown some ice cold water on the Fed's decision-making process when it comes to these rate hikes. And, it's really interesting because June rate hike odds crashed to 2% and July rate hike odds, when you look kind of at the span of things, stocks plunge, gold soars, the dollar dumps, bond yields spike. And now you mentioned gold. Now, gold has been very schizophrenic. What is going on with gold prices? And then I kind of want you to bring that into how the dollar is losing ground in BRICS nations.
Well, they're a combination of the same. When the rate hike happened in December, most people thought that gold would decline some more. But that was not the reaction. The reaction was in January, we had the stock market fall for the first 17 days of the month. Nearly an unprecedented thing in my lifetime that I can remember.
Yeah.
But the first 17 days of the month, and then overall during the entire month of January, and we saw gold, of course, jump off its lows of 1040 to reach into the 1200s. Then it consolidated through February, and then it had certain spikes because now it's at the point that the dollar is under pressure and the dollar is in danger. And gold has always been the checks and balances of any currency. And so that's why you saw, even though the gold was in the 1100s for most of the last 2-3 years against the dollar, it was at near all-time highs in Europe. It was at all-time highs in Japan. It was all-time highs in Thailand. Against other currencies, which were not manipulating it, it was at all-time highs, but only against the dollar. And since the dollar is the global reserve, that's where, the catalyst comes. But here's the thing. When you take a look at what's going on with the dollar and gold, there's an old saying, if you want to be rich, you do what the rich do. And the rich are buying gold hand over fist. George Soros, Stanley Druckenmiller, long-standing billionaire hedge fund manager, one of the oldest banks in the world, Breckenborg, they just are putting 30% of their clients' assets in gold.
When top hedge fund managers are getting into gold, fearing a bank run on cash, something's going on, right?
Well, that's just it. They know what's coming down the pike. When a number of hedge fund managers are not only, who is it? Carl Icahn.
Right.
Carl Icahn has divested himself completely out of Apple, completely out of most stocks. You have, how about the bond king, Bill Gross?
Yeah.
Bill Gross has shorted treasuries. Okay, so he knows that the treasury is being dumped. He knows that the dollar is going to decline, and so that leaves what? That leaves gold as the monetary asset that's going to really, go big when this thing happens. We also have shortages. We have all-time highs in coin sales from the mint. Canada just came out with their quarterly. They had their highest record month over month for between 2016 and 2015. So the world is buying gold and silver. We already know for the last 4 years that China, India, Russia have accumulated it. This is also why you're seeing this war against the BRICS. Now, Paul Craig Roberts wrote an article recently about Washington's war against the BRICS.
Right.
Well, it started out first with Russia, the sanctions. Then it went to China with these massive, outlandish tariffs against Chinese steel. Then we just saw a coup take place in Brazil where they put in the former corrupt leadership who was tied to Petrobras. And in 2 weeks' time, this leadership has removed all of the connections that Brazil had with the BRICS. They've also removed all of the reforms that were done, and they're making sure that they protect themselves from lawsuits that were coming from their theft and bribery with their oil company. So we have Brazil, and now we have South Africa. over the course of the last month, there have been massive protests that have been funded, just like what happened in Kiev, Ukraine, just like what's happening here in the States with Black Lives Matter, what happened in Ferguson. All of these things, they're funded by NGOs. They're funded to bring about civil unrest, which leads to governments having to look in instead of going outward and saying, hey, the dollar is affecting our economy. We want to go to where there's free trade. We want to look into gold. We want to look into other bilateral currencies. And Washington is desperate to keep dollar hegemony. So they are inciting revolution and rebellion all across any nation. Look who else they threw under the bus. Their petrodollar partner, Saudi Arabia.
Right.
Not only threatening them with going out with information regarding 9/11, but they're also threatening to cut them off from being able to sell their treasuries for currency. So you're seeing what we're seeing with things like the dollar and gold, the geopolitical events that are in this economic proxy war between the dollar and between those who want to divest themselves from dollars. There's so many things that are taking place, but those are the root causes.
You nailed it when you said geopolitically, we've got so much going on here. No, I mean, the partnership between the EU and ASEAN, you're looking at the, fourth largest economy ever. You've got a lot of gold and silver manipulation going on. That could be relevant. I mean, the revelations by Deutsche Bank of gold and silver manipulation, I think, are just the tip of the iceberg. And then what about the Shanghai Gold Exchange? You've got some really weird stuff going on with, fraudulent pricing institutions for gold. And then what's really wild, and I think this bears watching, Ken, is that Chinese, remember they signed that MOU with SWIFT. I mean, they're merging with their upstart system. And my gut's telling me that this is very much going to marginalize America as the processor of global payments, right?
Yeah, and this goes back to something Dr. Jim Willey revealed back in late 2013, just before the overthrow in Kiev,
right,
is that 130, 140 nations had secretly signed a global currency reset, including the United States had been a part of that. But to do so, the dollar would have lost its standing as the singular polar reserve currency. The U.S. would have lost a lot of standing economically and politically in the world. And so they backed out. Instead, they caused this war, which led that pact, that currency reset pact, fall by the wayside. It was then 2013 that you started seeing China say, "Fine, if if this is the way you're going to be, if you can't act as a fair partner in the world when it comes to treaties," and I can't think of any treaty going back to the Native Americans that the U.S. government hasn't broken. So it's totally understandable. But when you take a look at what China did, it was at that point that they started creating these new trade associations. They expanded the ASEAN. Russia, at the same time, created the Eurasian Economic Union and started bringing in some of the oil countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. You saw China start to create infrastructures to mirror every financial system that's in the West. The BRICS Bank was to duplicate the World Bank. The AIIB is to duplicate the IMF. Their CIPS system is to duplicate SWIFT, which will allow all these other countries to bypass the dollar as the medium of exchange and go directly into bilateral trade. Then, of course, the Shanghai Gold Exchange, because eventually the world is screaming for a return to a gold standard of some sort. I mean, if you imagine the type of debt that we have globally, both nationally and globally, over $250 billion when it comes to, adding all the derivatives, adding all the debt, adding all the sovereign debt, the municipal debt, the corporate debt. I was listening to an interview just recently, and it's astonishing. We have turned our system since 1971, when we went off the gold standard, that the economy requires new credit to be created, new debt to be created, just to survive. This is one of the reasons why the ECB, no matter what, keeps doing quantitative easing and buying bonds. It has gotten so convoluted with the central banks having to fund the system with creation of new money. Get this. There is a merger being in talk right now between Monsanto and Bayer, German company and a U.S. company.
You bet.
And it was for $62 billion was the offer. The Monsanto turned it down, but they said we're interested in negotiations, i.e. they want more money for the merger. Now, the ECB has already bought sovereign debt. They've already bought municipal debt. Now they are buying corporate debt. So what Bayer can do is they can create a corporate bond and sell it out there. And then they can have the ECB buy that corporate bond, and then they can use that money to do the merger. So the ECB will pay Bayer to buy Monsanto.
Complete insanity. Well, how does China fit in with all this, Ken?
China, people have to remember, this is one of the things that Americans have a difficult time relating to versus Chinese. The Chinese think in long term. Right. They're extremely patient. In the U.S., we have a 5 to 15 minute attention span. What did the Kardashians do 5 minutes ago? Wow. Okay. What did Kanye do 5 minutes ago? Wow. And we don't play the long game, but the Chinese do. The Chinese do not want the global economic system to crash by something they did. They are waiting patiently for events or black swans to bring down the system on its own where China is not involved and can't be blamed for it. If you notice, when there's any type of economic crisis or the economy is in a downturn, the Fed or the government loves to blame somebody else. Oh, it's the Iraq war. Oh, it's the weather. Oh, it's this. No, China doesn't want to be blamed for it, because then the U.S. can try to use war, military war, to go after any country. That's why they went after Libya. That's why they're going after Syria. That's why they went after Iraq, Afghanistan. They justify these things. The sanctions against Iran. The U.S. should have no right to declare sanctions against anybody and expect everybody else to follow them.
Well, what is the Chinese energy deals? I mean, look at these Russian oil and gas to China deals, payments in local currency, not in dollars. Of course, you've already got, look at the currencies between China and Russia in bilateral trade. The increase is 10 times over here. So what implication does this all really have? Because I don't even know. Do you think, Ken, that China really even wants to be the world reserve currency?
No, they don't want to have a singular polar currency. They want a basket of currencies. They want multiple. And the reason that we have a singular currency is because after World War II, most of the economies of the world were shattered. Nobody had gold or silver back it up. There was no production. So the U.S. was by far the singular economy that could sustain, and thus the dollar at Bretton Woods became the global reserve currency. However, there were a lot of caveats behind that. There was the promises that it would be backed by gold, that these nations, if they didn't want dollars, they could trade for gold at the discount at the Fed window or the Treasury window. And in the 1960s, when the U.S. wanted to go to war, they didn't have the money for it, so they expanded the money supply. And that's where inflation, when the U.S. expands the money supply, since most of the dollars are offshore, because the whole world needs dollars to buy energy, to buy commodities, to do trade. Since most of the money was offshore, when it's expanded, of course, you export inflation to all these countries. So these countries were getting inflation in their economy, and that's why France said, enough of this, we don't want your dollars, we want gold. And from about 1965, 1968, France started just siphoning gold from the U.S. and getting rid of their dollars because the dollar was devaluing. Eventually, that led to 71 when the discount window got closed, or the gold window got closed. And for a short time, we had a massive amount of confusion. And maybe not a lot of people remember this, but it was because the dollar went off the gold standard that we had the oil crisis in 73. And it was then that Kissinger said, okay, I'm going to go talk to OPEC, i.e. Saudi Arabia, and let's see if we can make a deal. And they made a deal. And Saudi Arabia got to raise the price 3 times. The U.S. oil companies all got rich, and the dollar then retained its power as a singular reserve currency. China doesn't want to do this because the responsibility of monetary policy, and this is what this is the underlying secret that the Fed and the government never tell you. When the Fed makes policy against the dollar, they'll say outwardly, we're doing this for the U.S. economy and for the U.S. monetary system. But since the dollar is the global reserve currency, anytime the Fed does policy, it affects everybody. And China doesn't want that. China doesn't want to have to deal with their own internal economy while at the same time being hamstrung from affecting policy on the yuan or the renminbi and having it affect the rest of the world. So they want a gold standard. And they're slowly bringing about things for a gold standard. It's probably going to start first when China determines that the West is completely out of gold. They just recently bought two huge vaults in the city of London. So they're taking over the London gold fix. Eventually, they're going to demand delivery from the COMEX because they're the ones who have the majority of longs in the COMEX gold and silver futures market. They're going to demand delivery, and once that happens, the COMEX in the U.S. are going to say, "Oops, we don't have the gold. We've just got to do a cash settlement," and nobody will buy gold and silver from the COMEX anymore. So they'll have control of the London gold fix. The COMEX will be gone, and the Shanghai Gold Exchange will be the singular global physical market in the world. Well, that's going to expand too, because besides the EEU expanding with the ASEAN coalitions, trade partnerships, there's right now talks between Russia and China of creating a dual gold market between the two. And so when you have Eurasia and Asia in charge of gold moving from the west to the east, then they can determine how that gold is going to be used. They might decide to say, now that we have 40 to 50% of the world doing trade with us, not in dollars, but in rubles and yuan and other currencies, their own currencies, we are going to make sure we have a stable, sound money system. So we're going to back trade agreements in gold. And what they'll do is they'll have their neutral vaults where countries will put a certain amount of gold in there. That's their gold. It's segregated, but it's going to be used to backstop trade agreements. And then once you have trade agreements backstop with gold, then the next step, of course, is going to be currencies.
Well, gold runs the game. Let's face it. Whoever holds the gold they hold the power, right? And think about the amount of gold. I mean, China has 25,000 tons at least. It's recorded. Russia, probably about the same. But the U.S. Treasury basically has no gold, or maybe a couple barrels of old gold. Think of British Petroleum, Dutch Shell, OPEC, stagflation from the oil crisis. You mentioned Bretton Woods. I mean, Ken, when you create this unrestricted, unregulated, 100-year-old Federal Reserve fox watching over the gold-filled henhouse, and Bretton Woods is significant there because there was really nothing stopping the Fed from printing and expanding the whole entire supply of Federal Reserve notes. And no thanks to Nixon, as you said, issuing a decree and then flooding the world with paper dollars. That really robbed every nation of the world, didn't it?
Yeah, and the closing of the gold window, when Nixon did it, his Treasury Secretary Conley made it a temporary thing. It was supposed to be temporary.
Right.
But it's similar to like the Federal Reserve. When the Federal Reserve was first created in 1913, it had limited mandates. It actually wasn't a bad idea because rather than the taxpayer bailing out banks, you had a private bank that would demand insurance from all of the other banks, and it would be there as a lender of last resort in case of a financial crisis in the banks. That's fine. But one of the rules that came out in the Federal Reserve Act was that the Fed could not buy sovereign bonds.
Right on.
It could not buy U.S. Treasuries. Well, that was 1913. What happened in 1916 and 17? World War I, and the U.S. wanted to get involved. And, of course, they didn't have the money. So Congress then changed and passed a law that said, oh, yeah, the central bank can go ahead and buy treasuries and war bonds. And so that suddenly, when all that money started coming in, you had the end of the war. And do you think Congress retracted it? No. They said, this is a great way to get a lot of money. And so the central bank started printing out money. And when you have a lot of money and you really don't have a lot of things to buy with it, most people, they gamble it. Yeah. And that's where speculation led to the stock market soaring to super rates and eventually crashing. And the Fed, of course, was then scared to death because they knew that their policies had created the stock market crash. And so they were leery from creating a lot of extra money during the Great Depression. And since FDR took us off the gold standard and confiscated gold, then we were sort of stuck. Because if you have a fiat currency system, you need continuous creation of new money to just sustain and keep the system going. Well, when we're on a gold standard, that limits that. And when the gold is out of the system and the Fed is leery to create a lot of money because they don't want to create another bubble, then we have an extended Great Depression. That is what we're seeing today with what's going on in our markets, is that during the gold time of 1971, it was a temporary respite to try to slow down the other countries from demanding gold for dollars, but it didn't work. And so they were forced to then create the petrodollar system. We're seeing that, of course, today is the Fed has built its bubbles from the Greenspan bubble,
Yep.
or as they say, the Greenspan put, during the Clinton years. And a lot of that came from 1987, the stock market crash in 1987, is that they were scared to death of any major crash in the markets. So they started doing a lot of monetary policy, jiggering with interest rates, creating new money just to try to avoid a major crash. But by putting out all that money, just like 1920s, it's now been a speculatory bubble. So during the Clinton years, we had the dot-com. During the early 2000s, we had the housing bubble. And now we've got a return of the housing bubble. We've got a bond bubble. We've got a stock bubble. And we've got a credit bubble. Now we've got 4 bubbles that are going to pop at any time. And if the dollar goes, then the entire global financial system goes.
So what's the bottom line in all this, Ken? And what do you see coming here? Of course, we're now in June 2016. What's the bottom line with all this?
Bottom line is where we are seeing sovereign nations unable to pay back a lot of their debts. The austerity is coming to most of Europe. This is why Britain wants to leave. The people of Britain want to leave the European Union. The European Union is at the point that they cannot economically control what's going on with these countries. So they want to merge into a political union and have all control from an unelected body. But the problem is that thanks to the sanctions that the U.S. did against Russia, which are going back on Europe, they're the ones who are being hurt. Russia said, fine, if you don't want to sell us your goods and your produce, we have all these other countries that are more than willing to do so. And they've created new coalitions. And that's what led to, the 2 former adversaries of Russia and China becoming great partners. And Europe is being left stuck in the middle, having to follow the U.S. because of Washington and the fear. I mean, look at what France has gone through. France has gone through 4 terrorist attacks anytime that they wanted to start moving into Russia's camp. So there's a lot of fear in Europe. There's a lot of fear, of course, going on in the BRICS nations now. They're getting the Libya and the Syria treatment. And the world is what is going to happen is there's going to come a certain point that there is a black swan financial event that the U.S. is going to be blamed. And does the U.S. have enough leadership to come to the table, or are they just going to launch the nukes and start a war, start a new war? We are in the 100-year war cycle. This is the same decade that World War I was in. I really don't have an absolute picture of what's going to happen, but the culmination is that the dollar's days are soon to be done. A gold standard is going to return, and the only thing, because everybody's livelihood is based on paper-based assets. If you're not into intrinsically physical assets and out of the banking system, then you will lose everything that you have.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. Well, the EU, you mentioned, they have one interesting format in which Russia could potentially exploit. Maybe this is why Putin seems to be riding on Greece to help end these sanctions against Russia from the EU, because ever since, as you said, the U.S. imposed those sanctions on Russia in the early part of 2014, the EU has, they've followed Washington's policy like a lapdog. So I wonder if this coalition Because of course, when you look at what's going on with the oligarchs in Brussels and you look at Goldman Sachs and these corrupt technocrats, I wonder what Putin's doing in all this. I mean, it looks like there could be, ride on Greece to help end those sanctions.
Well, recently he made an agreement with Greece. Interestingly enough, last year when Greece and Germany and the IMF and the Troika were all going at it, where Varoufakis was
standing big,
as this finance minister and ready to stand as a single man against the entire EU. Russia offered to fund Greece.
Yes.
And Greece backed down. And so Russia pulled completely out. It was a matter of Greece did not want to give in to another dominion and authority. They wanted to have their cake and eat it too, and Russia very quickly said, fine, you're on your own. And we saw what happened. Greece eventually capitulated. Now they're just begging the IMF to get funds just to pay off their next default payment. The austerity is now into its 7th year. Well, all Putin had to do is be patient. And now he's coming back to them and said, we want to offer you opportunities to save your economy and to through an energy deal. However, behind the scenes, he's also giving the caveat. In June here, you've got the EU sanction votes coming up. Every vote of this measure has to be unanimous by all member states. So you can see probably behind the scenes that Russia is holding, the carrot and the stick
right
at Greece and saying, you just have to be the single vote that ends these sanctions. And guess what? I guarantee that France, Spain, all of these countries that were shipping produce and are now tens of billions of dollars, if not hundreds of billions of dollars in lost revenues over the past 3 years of sanctions, they're going to love it. And here's something else the sanctions have done. They have created a political turmoil in the European Union that is the equivalent of the Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders phenomenon.
Right.
We have Marine Le Pen and a radical party probably going to win in elections in France. We have Britain talking about leaving the European Union, and the popular vote is right now that they're going to do it. We just last year had the vote of Scotland to secede from the United Kingdom. We've got all that's going on in Spain and in Italy and Portugal, and of course Greece. We've got all of these changes of radical governments they're coming through, just like the 1920s and 30s in Europe, when we had the rise of Mussolini and the rise of Hitler and a lot of the fear of communism. We've got all these changes because there's a frequency in the world that changed, about 2014, 2015, 2016, and going into 2017. There's a frequency of absolute change, just like it did in 1914 to 1918. And what's going to come about it is those old empires, the Austro-Hungarian, the Ottoman, the German, the Prussian empires,
right,
they all went away when the ashes were done. And the U.S. is going to do the same thing. They're trying to hold on to something that is in the midst of change, and it's really going to fail immensely. And those that are willing to adapt to change, like Eurasia, like the ASEAN, like China, like the BRICS nations, like the Middle East is doing by pretty much coming to the point of ending OPEC and joining a global energy coalition that's going to be led by Russia. You've got what's going on in the Middle East is going to have immense effects on what happens to Europe going forward, and of course what happens to Asia going forward.
Well, this is it's one big absolute train wreck. But Ken, what's in the waning moments? What's the end game here? What does all this mean also for Joe Sixpack?
Yeah, well, the problem is that, like I said, most people trust banks. Most people have their money stored in banks. They have their investments and retirements in paper assets. They rely on governments. Unfortunately, so many rely upon government benefits. 100, we talked about those who aren't working and the non-participation. 94 million. Well, there's 100 million Americans alone that receive some sort of government benefit. We have 48 million that are getting food stamps. We have even more that are getting other types of benefits like Section 8 or disability, etc. Well, those people, because they are relying upon a dollar-based system that will inevitably collapse and devalue, and a government that can no longer sustain Social Security during a time of a 2-week government shutdown, that if you don't have something that's going to be part of the new financial system, which is tangible assets, which is gold and silver, because to be able to sustain the debt, unless they did an absolute jubilee and got rid of all this debt and just decided to declare it across the world, they're going to have to backstop the debt. And they're going to backstop the debt by going back to a gold and silver standard and raising the price of gold to a value that can be able to sustain the debt. That's going to be probably between $10,000 and $50,000, depending on how much percentage of the debt they use the gold for. If they use it for like 20% of the debt or a currency, then it'll be in the 10 to 15,000 range. If they decide to go 100%, then you're going to see gold at 50 to 100,000. So if you want to protect yourself, you've got to prepare for the eventual financial system that's going to come out of the vacuum of the chaos that we're seeing now. And expect the dollar to eventually fail. Expect the world to go back to some type of trade system, and that bilateral currencies are going to be the norm, and the dollar itself is going to no longer be the reserve currency. And we are going to at least go back to a second world nation, because the difference between us and China is China at least has infrastructure. Even if they built these ghost cities, they're all brand new. They've got their own production so they can sell products and export them. But even more so, China's debt is all internal. Yeah. They can wipe it away with the click of a mouse.
Yeah.
America's debt is all external. That means that you're going to have every nation in the world demanding recompense from Washington. And if they do that, then the U.S. is going to be isolated and nobody's ever going to trade with us. Well, since we don't produce anything anymore and we don't get things shipped in because nobody wants to trade with us, our standard of living is going to go down to third world country very easy.
Wow. Yeah. Well, and plus the cashless society cometh, and that's a whole other show that we will do soon. Tell people where the best place is they can get a hold of you.
Yeah. You can check out all my news articles at thedailyeconomist.com. I RSS in from other places I write for. I also write with the Guerrilla Economist at roguemoney.net. And for anybody interested in offshoring their money and getting into gold, and I work with a business that also deals with that, and that's what I do. I don't keep money in the banks, and I don't keep it where the government or bail-ins can touch it.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Ken. Well, thanks for coming on today, Ken, and do come back and see us soon.
Will do. Thanks again, Sheila.
Thanks, Ken. Folks, that was Kenneth Schortgen from the Daily Economist. All his information is linked there on today, June 3rd bio, there at weekendvigilante.com. We have a fantastic lineup next week. Ken mentioned earlier in the program, Dr. Jim Willey. He's going to be coming on with us. Paul McGuire, Pastor David Langford. We have a fantastic lineup next week. Hey, and if you have a guest request, that is, if you think a particular guest would be good on my program, do shoot me an email and let me know some more information about that. And on a final note, please do remember, this broadcast is 100% listener supported. No annoying infomercials. It's unplugged, uncut, unbiased. And I think you'll agree there's very few shows out there that give you the kind of content on this show. I thank you very much for tuning into the program today. Have a very blessed weekend. We'll see you Monday. Good night and God bless.